It's a brilliant idea. It's completely unworkable, and it forgets, as the Police Federation have pointed out, the fact that the government or governments of which Boris Johnson has been a part for the last decade or so have slashed police numbers by more in numbers and in percentage terms than any government in our history. We're only halfway back to recruiting officers to replace the 21,000 officers that were lost during that period. And let's not forget that in addition to over 20,000 police officers, almost 40,000 members of police staff were made redundant or otherwise got rid of during the same period. And that means that police officers are under enormous stress. Now, I represent the victims of serious violence and other forms of crime, and particularly women who are the victims of domestic violence and sexual crime. And they all tell me absolutely consistently and without hesitation that there has never been a worse time to be a victim of such crimes, and many of them are thinking of giving up. Now, of course, in theory, it's a good idea that they have access to some sort of direct line to police officers. But the problem is, if those police officers are dealing with 100 other victims or 200 other victims of the same sort of crime, they're not going to be able to answer the phone. And the women's frustration and the victims' frustration is going to get more and more and more. And that's not going to change until we get way, way more police officers than we've ever had before.
Do you think a big part of, the fact that the police these days just seem to be unable to investigate anything? There have been news reports about people's cars being nicked and the police going, well, we're not going to find it, so close the case. Do you think the problem is that there's now such a sort of hefty catalogue of crime, everything from hate speech to offending someone online, that, rather than prioritising on the stuff that really needs to be prioritised, the police are just constantly snowed under, as well as having their numbers massively reduced?
You're absolutely right that there are so many more kinds of crime now. There is hate crime online. There is particularly amongst young people an enormous amount of sexual threats, sexual offending, sexual image offending, as well as threats of violence and other forms of threats. So there's all of those sorts of crimes, which are still crimes. I mean, if you incite, as sadly many people do, a young girl, underage girl, to send naked pictures of herself online, that's a very serious crime that needs to be investigated, because those young girls are at serious risk from paedophiles and other forms of offenders. So all of that is real crime with real victims. And as I say, we're dealing with all of that new crime, which is committed on an industrial scale, including, of course, industrial scale fraud offences. Again, many people have their credit cards hacked or their bank accounts or their identities stolen. All of those are real crimes with real victims. So there's more crime of many different kinds than we had when I started as a criminal lawyer almost 30 years ago, but with fewer police officers than we had in 2010. So the truth of it is that it's not some sort of political correctness most of the time about these cases. It's real victims who are really seriously frightened or threatened or otherwise harmed. But we just don't have enough resource. We don't have enough police officers, and we don't, frankly, have enough courts open in this country. Not only have hundreds and hundreds of police stations been shut down, but hundreds of courts have been shut down, and the delays in the criminal courts to bring these cases to trial, some of them are now running up to a decade, is the estimate, before we'll clear the backlog before COVID. So all of this needs the sort of emergency response that we had to the COVID pandemic in so many other areas. It hasn't been at the same reflection in the criminal justice system. We've not seen the sorts of massive resources thrown into criminal justice that we have in so many other areas of our public life. And until we do, it's not just about money, it's about commitment, and it's about sensible, rational policy. As I talk about in my book, it's no good just having more and more prison places and longer prison sentences. We've actually got to address the causes of crime and the reasons people keep reoffending. And Boris Johnson's announcement does nothing to address any of it.
So Chris, just quickly run us through then, what sort of policy ideas are you talking about? Because my next question was going to be, so you think it's more courts, more police, more money thrown at the problem, but you're talking about actual policy areas. Just give us an idea what you think needs to change.
Well, I've written a book, Justice on Trial. It's out in paperback, and it describes the three most important things we can do to reduce crime in our society. The first is to stop the addiction to the use of prison. The more we send people to prison, particularly young people to prison, the more crime we end up with, as they see in the United States, where they have millions of people, almost 2.5 million people in prison, and massive levels of crime. So stop our addiction to prison. Stop prohibiting and criminalising drugs, because drugs have been something people have taken since time began. And the war on drugs is a complete failure. The more we criminalise drugs, the worse our drug problem gets, and the more death and violence results and overdose results from drugs. So we need a legal, licensed and regulated drug supply network. And finally, and perhaps most importantly of all, we need to stop criminalising children. We have children as young as 10 years old who are taken to the criminal courts. Anyone who has children, I have 4 children, and the idea that I have a 10-year-old child, the idea that she is capable of the sorts of things that are required to establish a criminal conviction or a criminal record is utterly ridiculous. We need to raise the age of criminal responsibility to 18. We need to treat children as children, which is what they are. And if we adopt those 3 policy areas, we will see our criminal justice bill reduced by about 50% and the amount of violent and serious crime reduced by a similar amount. So real policies, real radical reform, not just sound bites from Boris Johnson, which frankly are ludicrous from a Prime Minister who's been part of governments that have cut the criminal justice system to the bone and have seen so many increases in serious and violent crime of so many kinds.
Do you think, as well as a barrister, that criminals today are actually getting emboldened by access to say, well, look, I've got my rights, and are sort of fighting back a lot more than they used to, and that as well is potentially sort of making the system more sluggish and making it harder to, get convictions?
No, it's quite the opposite. In fact, people haven't got access to lawyers anymore in the way that they did when I started in practice in the 1990s, where legal aid was properly funded, and someone who was accused of a crime, whether they be from a wealthy family or from the poorest and most underprivileged of communities, had access to proper lawyers and proper representation. That's no longer the case. Very, very few people now can get access to high quality criminal representation when they're accused of a crime. So the idea that people are wandering around thinking they're going to rely on some sort of legal loophole or other kind of way out of committing criminal behaviour, that may be the case for some wealthy people, but it's certainly not the case for the great majority of people in our country who don't even have access to proper legal representation when they get themselves in trouble. So the cuts we've seen in our criminal justice system to defence lawyers, to prosecutors who can't prosecute effectively, to police officers who can't police and investigate effectively, all of those things have contributed to the increase in public uncertainty and actually fear amongst many of your viewers, who I'm sure are of the view that they're less safe than they were 10, 20 or 30 years ago, and in many ways they're right.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.